A slap in the face at a national meeting? Or the spark that ignites a revolution? When two racist federal agents jostle a silent elderly man in front of a crowded assembly, they think they're simply abusing power once again. What they don't know is that this man isn't an extra. He's the President of the United States. And within 4 minutes, everything they thought they controlled begins to crumble. This is a story of arrogance, injustice that doesn't whisper, but screams. Washington, D.C., as is often the case, was frozen in its contradictions. Elegant facades, white marble, deep-rooted traditions. But beneath that facade, unresolved tensions were bubbling up. At 6 a.m., 84-year-old President Clint Eastwood entered the Capitol for a confidential session on police reform. His pace was slow but determined, his silver hair tied back, his piercing eyes let nothing pass, not even the microaggressions that others would never notice. He didn't need his formal attire to command respect. His mere presence silenced a room. The day's session seemed routine: presentation of statistics on juvenile delinquency, intervention by a young defendant, then validation of new federal measures. But the president's instincts, honed by decades of combat, sensed that something was amiss. As he entered the room, someone whispered to him, "Mr. President, Colonel Travis Boone is already on site." Eastwood stopped short. "Boone? That Boone?" "Yes, sir." All of Washington knew Boone. Career military man, third-generation protector of the nation, untouchable despite dozens of complaints. File after file closed. Too many contacts, too many debts to repay in high places. Eastwood entered calmly, unescorted. Boone didn't recognize him at first. He wasn't wearing a tie or a badge. In his eyes, this old man was just an assistant. "Are you here to defend this little delinquent?" Boone said arrogantly. The president didn't reply. He looked at the documents on the table. Then, without warning, Boone brutally approached. "I'm talking to you, man." And suddenly a slap slapped across the room. Absolute silence. Gasps. A cup of coffee shook on a table. Even the lights seemed to flicker. The president's face remained motionless, but his eyes had turned to steel. He slowly raised his head and stared at Boone. Boone stepped back, surprised by his own gesture, but not ashamed. "You people should learn to respect each other," he growled. Clint Eastwood took a step forward. The room froze as if time had stood still, and in an icy voice he said, "Is this how you treat your superiors, Colonel?" Boone shrieked. The silence was heavy. Then Eastwood slowly ascended the dais. A security guard let out a panicked breath. "My God, it's the president." Clint sat down, his gaze locked on that of his assailant. "Colonel Boone, did you strike the President of the United States in the middle of a federal meeting?" Boone opened his mouth, closed it again. I didn't know who you were. That's not what I asked. Did you raise your hand to me? Yes or no?" Cameras on. Heavy silence. "You thought I was inferior," Eastwood continued, "and that was enough for you to strike." Then he hit the table once, then twice. "Colonel Boone is under federal investigation for assaulting a head of state." Boone tried to protest. "You're exaggerating. That kid I arrested is a thug. I did my job." "Enough," thundered the president. "You won't justify violence against an innocent man with your prejudices." He turned to the cameras. "This isn't the first time this man has acted out of control, but it is the last time it will go unpunished." The slamming of the door sounded like a warning shot across the room. Federal Agent Mills stood beside Boone, hand resting on his belt, non-threatening, but ready. Boone remained frozen, red with anger, jaws clenched, fists clenched, as if he were holding back a storm. President Eastwood stood motionless behind his desk. His gaze was a steel stake in Boone's. No blinking, no pity, no blinking, no pity, no escape. "Mr. President," said a voice from the room. It was the prosecutor in charge of the vandalism case, an elderly, white, sparsely haired man, suddenly pale. "Do you wish to proceed with the program?" Eastwood slowly turned his head towards him. "I'll decide in a moment, but first I have something to say." He faced the audience. What just happened here is not a simple matter of protocol. It's a matter of law, precedent, and public trust. He stared at the reporters. "You've all seen a serving officer strike the President of the United States. You've heard his words. You've seen his posture. I want you to record this. I want you to remember it. Because if the law can't protect those who serve it with integrity, then we're no longer in a democracy. We're in something much darker. Absolute silence. Even the keyboards had stopped typing. Boone chuckled, unable to hold back. Are you really going to turn this into a media circus? Eastwood turned to him slowly. Is that what you think this is, Sergeant? Theatrics? No, it's accountability. He calmly descended the steps, his heels sounding like a countdown. You've been protected for a long time, haven't you? He said softly. I've seen officers like you, the kind who walk into a room thinking everyone else is inferior, who says I didn't know but really means I didn't care. Boone glanced at Mills with concern. The agent didn't move. Here's what's going to happen, Eastwood continued. Internal Affairs is already on its way. I'll be contacting the Attorney General myself before noon. The video of this incident will be sealed for legal review. But the press here, they'll be making headlines before lunch. You're destroying my life over a misunderstanding, shouted Boone. No, Sergeant, Eastwood replied in a cutting voice. You destroyed your career the second you hit me. The young boy arrested earlier was now watching Boone, not with fear, but with pity. A pity that dug deeper than any insult. I've served this nation for 20 years, shouted Boone. And now you throw me to the wolves for one mistake? Eastwood mounted the steps, resuming his post. I'm not throwing you to the wolves, Sergeant. I'm throwing you to the law. The same law you've used as a shield for 2 decades. Today, it no longer protects you. It's judging you. He sat down, his suit folding around him like armor. This session is not adjourned, he announced. But the hearing of the young accused is postponed until tomorrow. The arresting officer has compromised the integrity of this hearing. The young man rose to his feet, guided by his lawyer. He took one last look at Boone and left. His gaze had changed, straighter, more dignified. Boone remained frozen. His gaze no longer burned. He was calculating. Eastwood activated the microphone again. Agent Mills, please escort Sergeant Boone to Detention Room B. I'll inform Internal Affairs and the Chief of Police personally. This case is no longer internal. It's criminal. Boone didn't resist, but his teeth could be heard gnashing in restrained rage. As he passed, he whispered to Eastwood, You think you've won, don't you? Eastwood, without looking at him, No, but for once, the good loser lost. I think we're going to get along just fine. 6:00 a.m. The courthouse was technically open, but inside everything was asleep, except for one office. In the president's office, no one was sleeping a wink. Not Clint, not his advisor Carter, not the 2 internal affairs agents who had spent the night combing through 10 years of unsolved complaints. Carter entered with 2 steaming hot coffees. He placed one on the desk without a word, all of a sudden. Then he opened a file so thick it threatened to strangle the printer. How bad is it? He asked at last. Clint, eyes on his legal pad, replied without looking up. 19 complaints involving Boone, 12 concerning his direct colleagues, 4 prosecutors refusing to prosecute despite evidence, 2 missing body camera videos. Carter sighed heavily. It's not one rotten apple, it's the whole orchard that's dead. Clint looked up, dark, sharp, and that orchard was watered, protected, tended, methodically. Before Carter could answer, the phone rang. President Eastwood, a calm man's voice, familiar and icy. Clint, it's Chief Nolan. Clint leaned back. I've been expecting your call, not so soon, but I assume you've seen the video. I have, and I'm not calling to defend Boone. You're calling to contain the explosion. Silence. Nolan didn't deny it. Clint, this isn't just a cop losing his temper. It's a thread, and you're pulling it. It could bring down the whole institution. That's precisely the point. I'm not your enemy. Silence is complicity, Nolan. And the unions are already on my back. The mayor's demanding answers. And I hear you've contacted Internal Affairs without going through us. You're escalating. No, Clint replied icily. I'm revealing. A silence, then Nolan's voice grew harsher. You want to take Boone down? That's fine. But if you keep bringing out the names of commanders, prosecutors, former chiefs, it's going to fall apart, and we won't be able to clean up the rubble. Then maybe it's time to stop cleaning and rebuild. The call cut off. It sounded like a threat wrapped in a message of peace, Carter commented. Clint nodded. He's scared. Good. At that moment, the door opened without knocking. Agent Rosalind Keene entered, her face grave, a thin red folder in her hand. We found something. You need to see this. Clint met her halfway. She opened the file, a transcript, an audio recording. 2 years earlier, in a locker room, Boone's voice clear, sneering. Ever seen her up close and personal, that Judge Clara? She thinks her robe makes her invincible. Another voice, unidentified. What if she takes it out on you? Let her try, Boone replied. I've got friends higher than her. One complaint, and paf. A militant judge, ejected. Clint stared at the page. Who else heard that? We've only just found it. It was hidden in a secondary investigation. The second voice, we think it's District Attorney Carson Ramsey. Clint's heart pounded. If you can prove that, we're working on it, but that's not all. Keene pulled out another document. There was an emergency meeting last night at the DA's office. Someone is trying to remove you from the case under the pretext of conflict of interest. Clint clenched his jaw. They want me off. And if they succeed, they'll reduce Boone to malpractice and offer him early retirement. You'll be recused and the case buried. Clint looked at the clock, 7:02. I want a public hearing, I want the press, and I want to make it clear. If I step down, it's not because I'm biased. It's because I refuse to let this be buried in silence. Keene looked at him, impressed. Are you going to put up a front? No, said Clint. I'm going to blow it all up. By 9:00 a.m., the courthouse was abuzz. Journalists, rumors, tension. Something big was about to happen. Clint entered the Great Hall, not in costume, not as president, but as a man ready for battle. At the front, Prosecutor Carson Ramsey stood next to a representative of the Ethics Committee, a pale young man, stiff as a board, Elliot Parrish label hanging from his suit. President Eastwood, he said with a strained smile, we have received your request for a public hearing regarding your recusal. Clint nodded and addressed the press. I recuse myself from the Boone case, not because I'm impartial, but because I refuse to let this case drown in oblivion. He pulled out a file. Keene opened it. 3 complaints, 5 classified memos, 2 missing videos, a rigged trial in 2018, all signed by Carson Ramsey. Clint addressed him. You refused to prosecute Boone 5 times despite the evidence, and each time the defense was pressured into settlements. Black kids, no lawyers. Ramsey turned pale. Keene put down another document, a $15,000 wire transfer to a judicial fund, which was used to finance Boone's defense. Parrish stammered, that has no bearing. Yes, it does, said Clint. When public money protects the corrupt, it has everything to do with it. Then he looked at Ramsey. Who protected Boone when the video disappeared in 2019? The one where a minor ended up in hospital? Silence. Keene slipped a piece of paper. It was redirected to an external server run by a private contractor with ties to the mayor of Charleston. And who signed this contract? You did, Mr. Ramsey. The room exploded. Cameras, screams. Ramsey rose abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. This is slander. No, Clint replied, implacable. It's the truth, and she's late. I didn't recuse myself because I was afraid, nor because I was intimidated, and certainly not because I'll keep my mouth shut. President Eastwood's voice rang like a bell through the entire courtroom. This city has protected a system of unchecked power for far too long. Today is not about a slap in the face. It's about what happens when someone believes they can act without consequence, because every floor above them looks the other way. He stared Ramsey straight in the eye. Those floors are collapsing. Ramsey left the room in a sweat, followed by Parrish, pale but determined. Do you think they'll come for you? Asked Carter. They already have, Clint replied without hesitation. Just then his phone vibrated. Number unknown. A single message. You need to stop. No name, no direct threat, just 5 words. Clint showed Keen the screen. She read and said simply, "Perfect, that means we're doing it wrong." Clint looked out the window toward the buildings and rooftops full of secrets. He was no longer judging a cop. He was dismantling a machine. Meanwhile, in a cold cell, Boone felt the floor give way. He stared at his hands, the same hands that once inspired fear and respect. Now they trembled. He was alone, truly alone. Then the lock clicked. A man in a gray suit entered, bald, calm, icy. He tossed a file onto the bench. "Your salute or your anchor? What do you want with me?" "I represent interests very concerned by what President Eastwood is raising. You've been helpful, Boone, but now you're a burden. I've given everything to this country. That's why we haven't let you go yet. But if you keep letting her control the narrative, we won't have your back anymore." "So what do you want?" The man smiled. "For her to remember her place. Let her feel the fear. You know how to do it." He opened the folder. Photos of the Eastwood family, his sister, his nephew. "This is surveillance." "No, it's leverage." "You want me to threaten the president?" "No, just make him feel threatened, subtly enough to make him back off." "And if I do?" "A position at a private firm, no questions asked. Or, you rot here." And the man disappeared. Across town, Clint Eastwood walked the halls like a living thunderstorm. His phone vibrated, another message. Number unknown. "Beautiful house in Mount Pleasant. Is your nephew still biking home?" Clint froze, his hand tightened around the phone. He locked the door, handed it to Carter. "I want a name, and I want my nephew pulled out of school. Quietly." Carter nodded. "What about your sister?" "Someone you can trust in front of her house. 24 hours. That night, Boone was quietly transferred. Not released, not officially moved, just moved like a pawn. He was given a disposable phone, an unregistered vehicle, and a name, Clint Eastwood. The man in the suit reappeared one last time. "One warning, don't touch him. You don't go near him, you just make him doubt you." "I know how to do that," Boone growled, and he disappeared into the Charleston night. The next morning, Clint received a package, no label, no address, inside a photo of his nephew, taken 2 days earlier. On the back, handwritten, "Stay where you belong." Clint remained motionless, then picked up his phone. "Get me the U.S. Marshals, immediately." At the federal building, Clint sat facing 3 marshals and 2 DOJ representatives. He swiped the photo. "My nephew, taken without his knowledge, sent this morning. Boone is behind it." "Are you sure?" asked one of the marshals. "I'm sure it's his side, and if he sent that message, it's because we let him." "What are you asking for?" "Federal protection for my family, Boone's arrest before tonight, and a judicial freeze on all his cases for independent investigation." Francis Kwan of the DOJ raised his eyebrows. "That'll shake up the courts for months." "Then let them tremble." An hour later, the marshals were in pursuit of Boone. Clint, meanwhile, was walking through the courthouse, not like a judge, but like a storm. Keen was waiting for him with a new case. "We traced the phone, 2 calls, one to a shell company, linked to the mayor's campaign." Clint huffed. "So the ROT goes beyond the courts." "Way beyond," Keen confirmed. "This company, already spotted?" "Twice, once in a buried corruption case, and more recently by a journalist, Julia Spence, found dead, classified overdose." Clint froze. "She didn't have any priors, did she?" "No, but she had a talent for exposing the rotten ones." Clint stared down the hall, a silent fire in his eyes. "I want everything she was up to, every document, every source, just every thread, because now we're uprooting everything." Keen hesitated. "Mr. President, this is beyond Boone." Clint clenched his fist. "I know it is, and that's why we keep going." He pulled a duffel bag from the trunk, bills, a second disposable phone, and a Glock he wasn't supposed to own anymore. He wasn't going down without a fight. But before he reached the stairwell, a voice rang out. "Sergeant Boone!" He turned violently, gun half drawn. 4 federal marshals were waiting for him, weapons already raised. Drop it, Boone. For the first time, there was no bluff to be called, no rescue to be expected. Boone dropped the bag, then the gun, then fell to his knees slowly with a final thud. In court, Clint received the alert at 3:14 p.m. Boone arrested, no resistance, federal custody. He didn't smile. It wasn't a victory, it was a confirmation. He was already in a meeting with Keene, Carter, and Francis Kwan of the DOJ, who had returned with a briefcase full of newly declassified files. "We've reopened the Julia Spence file," Kwan announced. "The initial autopsy was inconclusive, but the coroner's report has been amended, with a private identifier since deleted." Clint murmured, "Someone's erasing the truth like they're using a pencil." "Not anymore," Kwan replied. "A joint task force is in place. Boone isn't talking yet." "He will," said Keene. Clint looked at the names, the dates, the diagrams, a map of systemic injustice. Then he got up, went to the window. The sun bathed the courthouse steps. People were waiting, journalists, survivors, citizens. Some carried placards. Others wore tired but determined faces. Carter approached. "You did it." "No," replied Clint. "I just turned on the light. That's them, scattered like cockroaches." "And now?" "Now we see how far down the tunnel goes." And the tunnel went down deep. Because Boone was just the beginning. The next day press conference. The steps of the federal courthouse were packed with people. Signs brandished, "Justice for all or for none." Clint, dressed in black, not a sitting president, but a standing citizen, looked out over the crowd. Keene murmured, "Boone's talking. He's naming names." "How many?" 12, 7 policemen, 2 prosecutors, 1 retired captain, 1 alderman, and..." She paused. "What?" She handed him a piece of paper. Clint read the name. His throat tightened. Judge Benjamin Hal Craftoft, his mentor, the one who had trained him, believed in him. "No issue." He approved 3 suspicious filings related to Boone. One involved a civil rights complaint. Never made it to court. Clint clenched his fists. This is beyond corrupt cops. This is institutional, judicial, political, generational. Keene nodded. "This kind of network only survives on silence." "Then we'll make some noise." Clint climbed to the podium. Cameras crackled. He spoke, not like a politician, but like a man standing in the ruins. "I became president because I believed in the promise of justice. But promises without deeds are just polite lies. Today I don't stand here as a head of state. I stand here as a witness to what has been destroyed and what must be rebuilt." He raised a folder. "Here are the names of 12 people who betrayed their oath. I'm not going to read them here, not out of fear, but because I respect procedure, which they have denied to so many others. We're not here because of a slap. We're here because of what it revealed, a system built on fear, silence, and loyalty to everything but the truth." Someone shouted from the back, "We're with you, President Eastwood." Applause, slow, then loud. But Keene knew the targets now would be on their backs. That evening, Clint returned to his office, exhausted but on his feet. A voicemail awaited him. Familiar voice, sharp. Hal Craftoft. "Clint, you put me on the list. I trained you, I backed you. But be careful. If you take down everything we've built, there'll be nothing left. No order, no peace. You don't want that. You don't want blood, Clint. You don't want case. Walk while you still can." Silence, then click. "Did he threaten you?" asked Carter. "No, worse, he warned me." "Are you backing out?" "Not for a second." Midnight, the smear campaign had begun. Anonymous articles, invented accusations, photos of a younger Clint, fist raised in a protest, hijacked. Even his nephew's school got a call. "Is your son being politically influenced at home?" "They don't just come for your name," says Carter. "They're coming for your lineage." Clint opened a drawer. Out came a small black notebook. "What's this?" "Everything I never said. About Hal Craftoft, about the corridors of private clubs, the silent agreements, the buried truths." Carter flipped through it, stunned. It's not a defense, Clint. It's a nuclear weapon. I don't just want to survive anymore. I want to make sure they can never hide again. 3 weeks later, federal court, crowded courtroom, cameras, federal guard. Clint wasn't wearing his presidential suit. He wasn't a judge. He was a witness. Boone, 5 federal charges. But he wasn't alone. Ramsey had resigned. Hal Kraftoff was suspended. 2 captains dismissed. 3 police witnesses. And the man in the gray suit, gone. Clint was called to the stand. President Eastwood, what happened that morning? I was hit by a man who thought I didn't belong. And what did that moment mean? That the system I'd served all my life was no longer capable of protecting me, nor anyone like me. Pause. And that if I didn't stand up, others never could. The jury didn't blink, nor did Boone. But he knew it was all over. 2 days later, guilty on all counts, but the tide had turned. A state inquiry was opened. 140 convictions re-examined. The governor announced judicial reform, and the Charleston police under federal control. On a rainy Thursday, Clint returned to the room where it all began. He stared at the bench, silent. Carter entered, soaking wet. They want to name the conference room after you. Clint smiled weakly. I'm not dead yet. Then serious. Do you think the reforms will stick? Some of them, others will take time. That's what they never say about justice. It's not an instant. It's a slow erosion and a rebuilding. Then he turned to Carter. It's time. That day, Clint tendered his resignation. He spoke to the people, not as a hero, but as a builder. I started the fire. It's not mine to enjoy. Change doesn't need a monument. It needs movement. Then he left, but not without saying, make sure that the next person to hold this office doesn't have to fight like me to be heard. 2 months later, his nephew was pedaling home, bag on his back. He saw Clint on the porch. He jumped off his bike and hugged him. I saw you on TV. You forced them to listen. Clint looked into his eyes. I forced them to watch, listening. That's still up to them. They sat there. The sun was setting. The world continued to turn. But now it was quiet. This isn't just a courtroom drama. It's a mirror held up to all society. And Clint Eastwood, he reminds us that sometimes to bring down an empire, all it takes is one man who refuses to be silenced.